good instructional reading would prioritize building that background knowledge, but they would also teach those reading skills like we were just talking about. But what tends to happen in reading is that there's a real focus on those skills, but not as much of a focus on building that background knowledge. So that is really important because background knowledge is the more significant component in how we learn and process what we read. And basically, we need to be teaching every subject in reading as well as teaching reading in every subject. It really goes both ways.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Welcome back, everyone. It is time for another episode here on the Teacher Edition podcast. I'm excited to be back with you, and I appreciate you taking time to join in as well. As a reminder, you can find us on social media. We're Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook, and we're also on YouTube as well. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok as Teacher Edition Pod. Our website also has great information about the episodes and about our guests. There's also a place there to sign up for our newsletter and to submit questions. We've had some really great questions and suggestions come in over the past couple of years, and I'd love to see even more come in this year. So be sure to check out our website, teachereditionpodcast.com, and leave your questions there. I am very excited to have Rachel Santopietro with us today. Rachel isn't a stranger to the Teacher Edition podcast. As we launch into year number 3, I wanted to bring her back on the show, but if you haven't listened to her other 2 episodes, be sure to go back and catch those. Rachel's so passionate about helping students really experience the joy of learning. She has degrees in chemistry, in education, and in learning design and technology. She's been a teacher as well as a writer, and she really pulls from both of those experiences in her current position, which is overseeing instructional design for the writing teams here at BJU Press. Rachel, thanks for being with us again here on the Teacher Edition podcast.
Glad to be back.
Okay, so Rachel, in your work here at BJU Press, you touch many subjects and you speak into many different courses, many different grade levels. I'm guessing you have some favorites, and we could talk about that, maybe favorite topics or units. I'm guessing there's some science in there with those subjects. So that being said, there are very few subjects that really find their way into every other subject, probably one of the main exceptions being reading. Having been a principal for many years, I had the opportunity to partner with many students who are struggling, and along with them, the many teachers and parents who were trying to support and help them along the way. And in so many cases, it really came down to reading and those reading skills. They were at the core of the struggle. Reading really affects everything. And when a student could learn to read and love to read, most often there was just a transformation in so many different areas. It really seems like reading and phonics are a constant hot topic in education. With educators, with publishers, with other educational professionals who just know that huge impact of reading. And it seems like they're constantly re-tackling the need for strong reading instruction and practices. I know you bump into that too as you work with, the production of different materials, the design of materials, but also as you're out interacting with other educators, and I know you look into research, you have a lot of different touch points. I know our listeners are bumping into this as well as all these different arenas. It seems like the focus is constantly shifting. The terminology changes, the practices, strategies come and go. I thought it'd be helpful to just talk about that today. I know one episode will only scratch the surface, but it's a start. Rachel, I mentioned that reading is one of those skills that really permeates all the other subjects. But communication in general is also vital. That's another topic kind of intersects there. What are your thoughts on that? Let's start there. Let's pull up to a higher viewpoint. What communication skills do you think that students really need to thrive in this day and age, in this 21st century?
Yeah, so I appreciate everything that you said about reading instruction. That's really crucial. And communication skills include reading, but along with that would be speaking, listening, viewing, and also writing. And if you think about maybe a student who wants to be a doctor, probably the first thing that you think about is they need to know science. Okay, well, Yes, they do need to know about science, but being a doctor is so much more than being able to know the science of the human body. They're viewing scans, so they have to be able to view and interpret what they're viewing. They're speaking to patients, they're listening to patients, they're reading reports, they're analyzing data, and all of that comes into that career as being a doctor. And I think even with our current emphasis on technology in our society, it's really interesting to note that one of the 21st century skills is communication and collaboration. So those things kind of all work together. So, Jenny, I'm going to read you a little passage that I had my 15-year-old write about something that he's interested in. And I'm going to see if you can guess what this is about. And you probably will be able to guess because you know me. But I'm going to read this to you because I want to.
Okay.
This is kind of a simulation. So, okay, so here's what he wrote. He said, my project starts out with juggy pockets in the Hueca with an optional placement of a Camelot C4.5. Afterwards, you get into the lower crux with a left hand one pad crimp and a right hand two finger pocket. The beta for this section is weird, but it will go. In the roof section, you have to do a lot of flogging to get through the red point crux. And finally, as reward for getting through the roof, you get a jug haul to the mussies. So, do you have any idea what that was about?
Okay, I'd say maybe I caught about 5% of those words. Let's say, okay, I'm wild guess, and this is just really broad, something with gaming. It sounds like we're making progress. We're getting somewhere. No?
The idea, there is an idea of a journey there. And I'm surprised you
Okay.
didn't get there because you know this about me. But me and my family are very much into rock climbing. So
Oh.
this paragraph
Obviously, I'm
is
not.
an entire paragraph about climbing one route up a wall,
Oh, wow.
which is really interesting. So none of those words are very long. Um,
No.
but to really understand this paragraph, and again, it was written by my 15-year-old. It's not like it's written by,
Impressive.
somebody with a
I'm impressed.
PhD or anything.
He stumped me. Don't tell him.
But it's really interesting because to really understand that paragraph, it's not very long. The words aren't very long. You have to understand some key vocabulary and you have to have some background knowledge in that subject to be able to comprehend the paragraph. So if I
Yeah,
were to
I was
hand
missing
this
both.
page to you, you could decode the words.
Sure.
You could say the words, but you wouldn't comprehend that paragraph. And that's because reading comprehension, science of reading tells us that reading comprehension is a combination of language comprehension and word recognition. So really the key to all of that, to that reading comprehension is really that background knowledge and that vocabulary.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. So, okay. I want to build on something you just mentioned. So, a term, or I don't know, maybe a phrase that we're hearing and seeing very often these days is science of reading. So, I'm guessing we have listeners who are very well versed on that, and we have others who have heard of it and aren't familiar with it. Maybe they're trying to figure out how this is something new and novel, or is it really new and novel? Talk with us about that since you mentioned it. What is the science of reading?
Sure. So the best way to figure out what the science of reading is, I could give you a long paragraph, and I'll just say it's basically a body of research about reading. So it's not a curriculum, it's not legislation, it's just a body of research about reading. And if you are, if our listeners are at your computer or whatever, or your phone, you want to pull out and Google the reading rope. That will give you a diagram that's a great overview of the science of reading. So I'll describe this diagram for you. And if you look it up, you can see it in action. So it shows two strands kind of twirling together. And those two strands represent kind of what I just talked about, the language comprehension and the word recognition. So in that language comprehension strand, you have four more strands. And those four strands are some of the things that I just talked about: background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. And then under the word recognition, you have those three strands, and that would be the phonological awareness. It's also called phonemic awareness, a decoding and spelling, which would really relate to phonics instruction, and then your sight recognition or your high frequency words. So as those twirl together, as a student becomes more proficient with their language comprehension and their word recognition, they're developing increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic skilled reading, and that leads to fluency. So that's kind of a summary of the science of reading.
Yeah, that's a great overview. So at the start of the episode, I mentioned how reading and reading strategies, I guess we could say generally, are one area that really kind of, I don't like the word leak, but it kind of leaks over into other subjects. What are your thoughts on that? And specifically, with the context of science of reading, how does that relate to other subjects? What do you think?
All right, so I'll mention that. So I mentioned those two strands. You've got your language comprehension and your word recognition. So with the word recognition strand, the subjects that really relate to the word recognition are going to be your phonics and your reading instruction, kind of in those early grades. So, honestly, we want students to be skilling out of phonics instruction by the time they get to third or fourth grade. All of the other subjects deal with that other strand, that language comprehension strand. So that's where you're building that vocabulary, that background knowledge, and that literacy knowledge. So that can happen in Bible class, that can happen in history class, science class. It can also happen in literature, but it's definitely going to be happening in all of the subjects.
Yeah, that's great. So, as we talk through various topics and strategies here on the podcast, we often talk about teaching practices. Teaching reading is an art, I would consider that. Having spent many, many years close to where that magic starts, it's just amazing watching master teachers help students learn to read. And when those gears start moving and that student starts reading, it is just like a whole new world opens up to that student. That is giving them a skill, honestly, that's going to change their lives. But not everything we teach is a skill. We might say we also teach content. Rachel, break that down a little bit. It might seem obvious, but talk about the difference between teaching skills and teaching content.
Well, I mean, when you're teaching content, especially when you're talking about reading, you're giving students tools and you're teaching them how to use these tools, and then you're giving them practice in using tools. So usually, especially in those younger grades, and even when you're talking about teaching reading, teaching literature, we tend to focus on giving students the strategies for reading. When we're talking about teaching content, we're focused more on explicit, systematic instruction that builds knowledge, starting at basic levels and then moving to more advanced knowledge. So, if you're thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, when you're talking about new content, you're going to start at very bottom with the recall that knowledge. You're going to build up to that understanding, and then you're going to cycle back around to that content each grade level, and you're going to be adding more depth, and you're going to be taking students to higher levels of thinking and cognitive development. So that's kind of the difference between teaching skills and teaching content.
Okay, so following down that path and kind of merging it with our discussion of science of reading, what are some common reading comprehension skills that we would teach students or need to teach students?
Yeah. So if the listeners are elementary teachers, these are going to sound really familiar, and you might even see these in subjects other than reading as well. So teaching, like identifying the main idea, helping students learn to summarize things in their own words, having students compare and contrast two things, maybe even using a Venn diagram, especially in reading where they're analyzing characters, they're analyzing plot. In a story, they might make predictions. In reading, you're often going to see them do some kind of visual analysis, and they might even make inferences from a reading story as well. Those are all common, and that's just a sampling. There are a lot of other reading skills and um, that teachers use, and we see those over and over again. And
Sure.
teachers spend a lot of time teaching these skills and practicing these skills in reading, especially in the early grades.
Yeah. Absolutely. And they're far reaching. I mean,
Yes.
it doesn't just stop because you finish first grade. I mean, those are
Yes.
really far reaching.
Oh, yeah.
So we've mentioned learning to read, but obviously learning to read doesn't stop there. Comprehension is a vital component for successful reading, but often that part is left off. We can check boxes of words per minute or incredible expression, but if comprehension isn't there, honestly, I mean, what's the point? Maybe a loaded question, but what do you think is the most effective way to teach reading comprehension? Any ideas?
Yeah. So, well, let's just go back to that paragraph that I read you.
Oh, no. I'm gonna have to go do
that
some
my
research on rock
that my
climbing.
son wrote.
Yeah, thanks for
You
that.
didn't really you were able, if I had given that to you, you could have read it. You could have decoded it, but you would not have had the reading comprehension to understand that
Mhm.
because you didn't know the vocabulary and you didn't have the background knowledge. So in 1987, there was a research study called the baseball experiment. And in this experiment, they gave students reading related to baseball, and they broke them up into four different groups based on their knowledge of baseball and based on their reading ability. So you have two different. So you're going to have low reading ability, high reading ability, low background knowledge, high background knowledge. They broke them up into the four groups.
I might have done better with the baseball. Yeah. I should have signed up for that one.
So the researchers found, this is really interesting, that the students that had the background knowledge in baseball, that was a greater predictor of their ability to comprehend than their reading ability, which is really,
Wow.
really interesting.
That's pretty
So
powerful.
it's very powerful. It shows how significant background knowledge is in developing reading comprehension. And so there's been some additional research that suggests that good instructional reading would prioritize building that background knowledge, but they would also teach those reading skills, like we were just talking about, those reading comprehension skills, like the summarizing and the compare and contrast. But what tends to happen in reading is that there's a real focus on those skills, but not as much of a focus on building that background knowledge. So that is really important because background knowledge is the more significant component in and how we learn and process what we read. And basically, we need to be teaching every subject in reading as well as teaching reading in every subject. It really goes both ways.
Hmm.
So that would really come
Yeah.
into play with including informational texts as part of reading and literature classes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's loop back to the very beginning and the comments about reading. Again, reading touching every subject. We obviously know that reading is part of the subject because the student has to read the book or has to read the assignment. But what about actually teaching reading in the subject? You just said what could be a really great quote in a classroom about teaching reading in every subject. So obviously, because you said it, you must think it's necessary, but how can it be done? What strategies could a teacher use to actually teach reading in every subject?
Yeah, so I mean, I boil it down to the two things: the building the background knowledge and developing that vocabulary. And that again, that's connecting with that language comprehension strand of the science of reading. And I can give some more details about that in a little bit. But generally, as you're building that background knowledge and as you're developing the vocabulary, you would use a model called the gradual release theory. And you might, maybe, I don't know if you've ever heard that term, Jenny. I didn't hear that term until like a year or two ago. And our listeners might have heard that term, but it's generally summed up by I do, we do, you do. So in a unit of instruction, the teacher is going to start out by doing a lot of direct instruction and a lot of support and modeling, and then it would move more towards collaboration strategies, and then eventually it would move to more independent activities. So as we do that, we're building that student background knowledge and we're really helping with the vocabulary acquisition.
Okay, so I want to drill down a little bit more on the background knowledge part because I really like that. A major focus of my doctoral study and my dissertation was the impact of background knowledge. So, in my specific study, I was looking at the impact of off-site learning or field trips based on where they're placed within the learning journey. So, I'm quite sure you and most of the listeners with us today have read my riveting dissertation, but in case you haven't, or maybe just to review, my findings indicated that the biggest impact on the effectiveness of a field trip was their background knowledge, what they brought to the table as they went into a new environment, as they were exposed to new information. And this referred to their experiences, to their knowledge, what they had already learned. All this played heavily into their knowledge and understanding gains in that offsite learning experience. So Rachel, talk with us more about the impact of background knowledge as it relates to reading. How could a teacher actually build background knowledge? Like that's really hard. How do you load them full of background knowledge so they can use that in more learning? What would you say?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the field trips because I wouldn't have even thought about that, but I could definitely see, how the field trips could be part of it. It's an experience. And then obviously this is where the parents and the teacher can come together with the students. So, I mean, honestly, building background knowledge is something that parents can do too. That's a huge part of, bringing learning
Absolutely.
home. And as a parent, I'm always trying to stuff my kids' heads full of something.
Sure you are.
I kind of feel like a homeschool parent whose kids are in a Christian school.
Right.
So I think that, you have to recognize that the parents can have a huge component here. But in the classroom, when you're talking about building background knowledge, one of the things that you can do is just have lots of books around, lots of books, lots of informational texts available to students, reading aloud to students. And reading aloud is really good because you can actually read beyond their grade level and you can remove the impediment of the decoding to actually help promote that background knowledge that will actually help them with the comprehension. And let me just tell you, you are never too old to be read to.
That is
Everyone loves
so
to be
true.
everyone loves to be read to. I think I read to my kids every night until my oldest was 16, and I had to stop because I started working on my doctoral degree. So
That's right. Now they can
that's
read your dissertation.
now they can read my dissertation. Someday maybe I'll write something besides dissertations and textbooks that people actually want to read.
You would be good at that, Rachel.
But so having lots of books around, reading aloud to the students, providing time for students to read. I mean, even in high school, I did a Zoom meeting yesterday with a high school teacher from Green Bay, Wisconsin. She's an English language arts teacher, but she provides time every single week. She takes one of her class periods every single week and just gives her kids time to read. So giving your kids time to read is really great. Actually having students share what they know about. So for example, my 15-year-old son, he would be absolutely thrilled to give a presentation on rock climbing to his class. If we can get students sharing knowledge with each other, and they may pay attention better because it's a peer
Sure.
rather than a teacher. We can have a really big part of it is having students complete manageable writing assignments in the content area. So if we can get them doing research, they're building their background knowledge as well. And even things like using anchor charts and graphic organizers can really help as they're taking in this information, but then they're also organizing it. So in a graphic, when they're using a graphic organizer, they're organizing information on paper. While they're organizing it on paper, they're also organizing it in their brains.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
that's really helpful. And even explicit systematic instruction, where you're starting at lower levels and you're moving to higher levels, and you're moving logically through material in a way that just rolls it out like a red carpet. That is really huge because we're affecting students, the structure of their knowledge. And that allows them to set up this mental cubby holes where they can put new knowledge as they learn. So all of those are really great ways to build background knowledge. And you can see how you could do that in any subject. You can really do that in any subject.
Yeah, those are excellent. And they're so practical. They're very easy. Having books, reading to them. I love being able to read, above their level. So they're getting that even if they can't decode all of that. Those who are readers, the amount of information they know is just amazing. You can just see the contrast, even in the younger students. Sharing, writing, instructing, those are all great. Okay, so that was background knowledge. The other part of teaching reading in every subject that you mentioned was vocabulary. So just before we wrap up, I want you to talk with us more about vocabulary. So obviously, vocabulary plays a significant role in reading, but I feel unfortunately it often gets a seat on the back burner in classes. What are your thoughts on how teachers can strategically teach vocabulary and kind of bring that to the forefront?
Yeah. So if our listeners do a Google search of tiers, vocabulary tiers, there are 3 tiers of vocabulary instruction. There's tier 1, that's at the bottom of the pyramid. That's the words we use every day. Tier 2, vocabulary, those would be words that you're going to encounter in lots of different subjects. So they're going to be kind of across the subjects, really interdisciplinary. So maybe an example would be the word grace. So we might see that in Bible class. We might see that in literature. We could see that in a variety of different areas. And then tier 3 vocabulary would be probably what we often think of vocabulary in like science or history, where it's discipline specific vocabulary. So like heterogeneous mixture or constitutional monarchy. Those would be tier 3 vocabulary. So as students move through stages of vocabulary acquisition where they're ignorant of a word to maybe they've heard it before, then maybe they kind of know it, and then eventually where they're incorporating it into their speech and their writing, there are strategies that we can do that, where we're reviewing context, we provide a student-friendly definition, we repeat the word, and then we interact with the word using instructional strategies. And it is really strategic to focus on those tier 2 words because they do span the subject areas. But of course, we want to do the tier 3 words as well. For multilingual learners, you might have to do some instruction on tier 1 vocabulary as well. But even ideas of focusing on word parts and morphology, roots, words, and combining forms could be really great. Doing word clouds, Freyer models, having students relate words, or find the missing words. Those are all really, really great. So I'll recommend 2 books if you're interested in more of learning
Great.
about this
Yes.
knowledge gap. That's on building background knowledge. And on vocabulary, another one that's really good is called Bringing Words to Life. And I mean, Christian education really started in America for the purpose of teaching kids to read the Bible. So I think when we are really focused on reading, we're really returning to our roots in Christian education, and that reading comprehension of the Bible is going to be so crucial for helping students to grow and learn to become more like Christ.
Yeah, very practical. Rachel, we could obviously spend many more episodes on this topic, but I just want to say thank you so much for your time, taking time to unpack this, even just a little bit. I know there's so much more to this, but you've done a great job of summarizing it and bringing it to light, the important parts there that we can highlight, things we need to pay attention to. I know that often we think of teaching reading as more K4, K5, first grade level, and it's their responsibility. But really, like you've said so many times in this episode, it is far more than that. And what you have shared has just really shed light on that. So thanks so much for your time today. Thanks for all you shared. It's just been really practical.
Happy to.
And listeners, thank you so much for joining us as well. Reading is foundational, but honing those skills doesn't stop in first grade. No matter what grade or what subject you teach, I hope you've gathered some insights and some great ideas today. As we wrap up, just a reminder to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to learn more about the show and to submit your questions for our upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day. But it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through His grace working in you. Now, go do what God has called you to do.